She spotted him from across the store, calm, polite, wearing a bright red MAGA hat. But in her eyes, that was enough to judge. Without a second thought, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, determined to teach him a lesson. What she didn't know, the man she was about to humiliate ran the entire state. Karen had always seen herself as a protector of civility, a self-appointed guardian of what she believed to be the acceptable moral fabric of society. In her world, people followed unspoken rules. They looked a certain way, spoke a certain way, and certainly never expressed opinions that strayed outside the social norm of her carefully curated environment. So when she encountered a man dressed in clean, casual clothes, save for one unmistakable symbol, a bright red MAGA hat, it wasn't curiosity that sparked within her. It was judgment. To Karen, the hat wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was a challenge, a defiance, an insult. It symbolized everything she believed should have been rejected long ago. It didn't matter who wore it or why, just the sight of it in her local upscale grocery store felt like a violation. She didn't stop to consider the man's intentions or his actions. She didn't care if he was quiet or kind or helpful. The hat alone defined him in her eyes, and in that moment, she decided he was a problem that needed to be handled. Her mind began to work fast, making assumptions to support her feelings. He must be looking for attention, she thought. He probably came here on purpose to start something to provoke decent people. She convinced herself that others must feel the same discomfort, even if no one said it out loud. After all, who would dare voice their concern in such a polarized time? That only strengthened her resolve. If no one else would speak up, she would. She had to. Karen began subtly expressing her disapproval to other shoppers. She positioned herself near others and made small, pointed remarks. Comments like, "Can you believe some people?" or "It's unbelievable what they think is acceptable now." She hoped to spark outrage, or at least some agreement. But her words were met with polite smiles or confused glances. No one shared her indignation, and worse, no one seemed to care. The man continued shopping, quietly, interacting politely with workers and customers. He showed no signs of aggression, no attempts at disruption. But that only irritated her more. It made him harder to criticize, harder to isolate. And yet, she had already made up her mind. She convinced herself that silence from others meant fear. They were afraid to say something. They didn't want to be accused of judging or stereotyping. But Karen, in her self-righteous belief, saw herself as the only one bold enough to do the right thing. She took out her phone and opened the camera. Snapping a discreet photo of the man from behind, she told herself she needed documentation in case things escalated. Even though nothing had escalated, her finger hovered over the call button. She knew what she was about to do. She told herself she wasn't calling the police over a hat, but over the threat she felt it represented, over the message she believed he was sending just by wearing it in public. Her emotions had already created the story in her mind. In her version, he wasn't a peaceful citizen shopping for groceries. He was a walking controversy, a silent aggressor, someone who didn't belong. She dialed. When the dispatcher answered, she exaggerated her voice, injecting concern. She used phrases like public disturbance and aggressive symbolism. She implied that he was watching people, making them feel unsafe, though no one had shown any sign of discomfort. She avoided directly saying the hat was the reason for her call, but let the implication linger between every word. She was careful, measured, strategic. She had done this sort of thing before, and she knew how to present herself as a concerned citizen rather than a biased observer. She ended the call feeling validated, believing she had done a public service. She began waiting by the entrance, arms folded, convinced she had restored order in some way. In her mind, this wasn't just about one man, it was about setting a boundary. Her boundary. She envisioned the authorities arriving, seeing what she saw, understanding her concerns. She expected nods of agreement, approval from others. She imagined the man being questioned, perhaps even removed from the store. Not because of what he did, but because of what he represented to her. She never once paused to consider if she was wrong. She didn't ask herself if this was an overreaction. She didn't reflect on whether her discomfort was personal or justified. She had already rewritten reality in her mind to support her feelings. She saw herself as the only person brave enough to act, when in fact, she was the only one who saw a threat where none existed. In that moment, Karen wasn't seeking justice. She was seeking control. And the phone call wasn't about safety, it was about punishment. Not for something done, but for something worn. Not for actions taken, but for silently daring to exist in her space with a point of view she didn't agree with. What she didn't realize, what she never even considered, was that the man she was so eager to judge had power far beyond anything she could comprehend. And the consequences of her assumptions were about to unfold in a way she would never forget. Karen could no longer contain the storm swelling within her. Every second that passed with a man still standing there felt like a personal affront. The longer he remained calm, the more she mistook his composure for arrogance. It wasn't just the hat anymore. It was the way he stood with quiet confidence, the ease with which he moved, and the fact that no one seemed to object to his presence. That more than anything ignited her anger into action. If the authorities were slow to respond, she would take it upon herself to make her voice heard. With a growing sense of self-righteousness, she made her way toward him, powered by the belief that she was speaking on behalf of everyone too polite to say what needed to be said. She had crafted an entire narrative in her head, one where this man was an intruder, where his presence was provocative, and where his hat was a direct assault on the values of her community. It no longer mattered that he was doing nothing wrong. His very existence, in her eyes, was the provocation. She assumed authority she didn't possess. She began accusing, using phrases loaded with presumption, asserting that he was making others uncomfortable, suggesting that his attire was a political weapon, framing him as someone intentionally trying to cause distress. Her words weren't requests for understanding, they were commands for compliance. But it was her tone, not his presence, that began to draw attention. People turned not because of the man in the red hat, but because of the woman raising her voice, creating tension where there had been none. Still, she pressed forward, emboldened by the belief that silence from others equaled agreement. She claimed to speak for the rest of us. She pointed fingers not at actions but at symbols. She used fear as justification and outrage as a shield. She demanded that he leave, insisting that people like him had no place here. She saw herself as the last line of defense in a world slipping out of her control, a world where even a grocery store wasn't safe from the ideas she despised. The man, still quiet and composed, refused to meet her energy with aggression. He didn't argue, didn't match her volume, didn't react the way she expected, and that, in turn, made her feel even more unsettled. She mistook his calm for mockery, his restraint for smugness. Her frustration deepened, because nothing she said seemed to shake him. In her world, confrontation usually led to either submission or conflict, but not indifference. His refusal to engage on her terms made her feel invisible, ineffective, powerless. Around them, a few customers began to linger, watching the tension unfold. But no one joined her. No one backed her up. Some looked away, others frowned, but none spoke up in her defense. Still, she remained convinced she was speaking truth to power. She believed she was unveiling an injustice others were too afraid to confront. She thought herself brave. She thought herself righteous. What she failed to realize was that her words, once rooted in moral certainty, now reeked of personal insecurity. She wasn't calling out injustice, she was reacting to discomfort. She wasn't protecting others, she was protecting her idea of what the world should look like. And in doing so, she had become the very thing she claimed to despise: intolerant, presumptive, and unwilling to coexist with difference. The man's refusal to leave didn't come from defiance, but from clarity. He knew he had done nothing wrong. He knew his rights, his place, and his dignity were not up for debate. He didn't need to raise his voice or defend his beliefs in that moment. His presence, calm and unshaken, said more than any words could. And the more Karen lashed out, the more clearly that contrast began to show. She had come to this moment expecting support, expecting applause for her courage. But instead, she began to sense isolation. No nods, no cheers, no affirmations. Just a growing awareness that perhaps she had misjudged not just the man, but the entire situation. Her certainty began to flicker, not because she believed she was wrong, but because no one else was confirming that she was right. Still, pride wouldn't let her back down. She stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the outcome she believed was inevitable: the arrival of the authorities, the removal of the man, the validation of her concerns. In her mind, this was still a matter of principle, of order, of safety. But what she had really started was a confrontation that exposed far more about her than it ever would about him. And as more eyes turned to her, not in admiration, but in quiet concern, she was about to learn a truth that would shatter the illusion of power she thought she held. Because the man she tried to push out didn't just belong there. He owned the room in ways she never imagined. The moment Karen had been waiting for finally arrived. Flashing lights reflected briefly off the storefront windows, and two uniformed officers entered the building with professional composure. To Karen, their presence was a confirmation that justice was about to be served. Her chest swelled with satisfaction. In her mind, this was the resolution, the part where her concerns would be validated, her discomfort addressed, and the so-called disturbance swiftly removed. She believed she had done her civic duty. All that remained was to watch it unfold exactly as she had imagined. With eager authority, she gestured toward the man, her voice cutting through the atmosphere with confidence. She asserted that he was the individual in question, the one she had reported, the one causing tension within the establishment. She assumed the officers would listen, nod in agreement, and act immediately. After all, she had given them all the information. She had painted the picture clearly. She had handed them a problem with a solution already baked in. Or so she thought. What happened next unraveled her version of reality in an instant. The officers did not move with urgency toward the man, nor did they adopt the stance of confrontation. Instead, the second they laid eyes on him, their expressions shifted subtly but unmistakably. The casual professionalism in their demeanor was replaced by something more formal, more cautious. They slowed their pace, adjusted their posture, and addressed the man with a tone laced with both recognition and respect. A name was spoken, a title, one that shattered the narrative Karen had built. Her assumptions, her biases, her imagined victory, undone by a single word: Governor. Everything she had said, every judgment she had passed, every accusation she had thrown, had been directed at the highest elected official in the state. A man not only fully within his rights to shop peacefully, but a man whose entire career had been built on service, diplomacy, and principle. The realization hit her with more force than any public reprimand could. She hadn't just misjudged a stranger, she had attempted to shame a leader. Silence fell over her thoughts like a crushing weight. The man, composed and unshaken as before, calmly confirmed his identity. No theatrics, no raised voice, no retaliation. He simply presented the truth she had refused to see. In his wallet was the badge of his office. In his voice, the authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything. And in his presence, the quiet strength of someone used to being underestimated, misunderstood, and mischaracterized, yet never deterred by it. The officers, now fully aware of the situation, adjusted their focus. No longer were they responding to a disturbance, they were responding to a mistake. Not his, but hers. Karen, still standing just feet away, felt the cold flush of embarrassment rise to her face. Her mouth opened, then closed. Words failed her. She had spent all her energy asserting control, but now she could feel it slipping through her fingers like sand. There were no accusations made by the governor. No need for indignation or offense. His mere presence had exposed the injustice. The truth had spoken louder than any defense. And now, everyone who had watched the unfolding drama began to understand what had really happened. Karen's actions, once cloaked in the language of concern, now revealed themselves as driven by assumption and bias. Her version of right and wrong had collided with reality and lost. The officers maintained composure, but a subtle shift had occurred. Their presence was no longer a weapon she could wield, but a mirror reflecting her own behavior. Her power in the situation had dissolved, and in its place was a haunting awareness that she had overstepped badly. She hadn't just called the police on an innocent man. She had tried to publicly humiliate the most powerful person in the state, all because of a hat and her own unchecked prejudice. In that moment, she was no longer the protagonist of her story. She had become the cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of assumption, a reminder of how quickly perception can turn into persecution when it isn't tempered with understanding. And though no punishment was delivered, no harsh words exchanged, the consequences were painfully clear. Her reputation, her credibility, and her self-image had taken a hit far more damaging than anything the governor could have imposed. Because sometimes the most powerful correction doesn't come from punishment, it comes from truth. Quiet, undeniable, and standing calmly in front of you. Reality hit harder than any confrontation Karen had imagined. What began as a self-imposed mission to protect public order had morphed into a moment of personal reckoning. She had tried to backtrack. Her voice, once commanding and sure, now trembled with excuses. She claimed she didn't really mean any harm, that she only wanted to keep the peace, that maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But her words no longer held weight, because everyone had seen the truth unfold in real time. The illusion of control, authority, and moral superiority had evaporated. What remained was a woman caught in the aftermath of her own actions, surrounded not by supporters, but by strangers who had watched her unravel. The same crowd she once believed would rally behind her now turned quiet, observant, some in disbelief, others with phones in hand, not to shame her, but to document a lesson. The irony was brutal. She had judged the man by the symbol he wore. She had assumed his story based on his appearance. And in doing so, she had exposed her own story, one that spoke volumes about prejudice, snap judgments, and the need to feel powerful by tearing someone else down. She hadn't protected peace. She had disrupted it. And now, peace was being restored, not by her, but in spite of her. The officers, once seen as her allies and enforcement, had subtly shifted roles. Their professionalism remained, but their purpose had changed. They were now mediators of a social imbalance, not enforcers of Karen's personal worldview. With quiet authority, they addressed her, not with confrontation, but with the weight of reality. Her behavior had sparked unnecessary tension. Her actions had created a disturbance. And while no one raised their voice, the decision was clear. She had to leave. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't a punishment in the traditional sense. It was something far more lasting, public accountability. She walked out not in handcuffs, but with her assumptions laid bare, her intentions unmasked, and her image, both internal and external, forever changed. People didn't yell. They didn't jeer. But the silence that followed her exit was louder than any reprimand. It was the silence of realization. Back inside, the governor, still dignified and composed, chose to speak. Not for vengeance, not to gloat, but to offer clarity. His voice was calm, his message measured. He didn't reference the incident directly. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what had happened. His words weren't about one person. They were about everyone. A reminder that dignity isn't worn, it's demonstrated. That respect isn't owed to opinions, but to actions. That power isn't always loud, and neither is truth. His message lingered in the air long after he finished. Respect, he said, is not determined by appearance, clothing, or political alignment. It's defined by how we treat one another when we think no one is watching. And in that moment, the crowd understood that this was bigger than a disagreement. Bigger than a hat. It was about the danger of rushing to judgment and the courage of remaining composed in the face of it. Karen's mistake wasn't simply misidentifying a man, it was believing she had the right to decide who did and didn't belong based on her personal comfort. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't sought understanding. She had labeled, decided, and acted all in a matter of minutes. And those minutes revealed more about her character than she ever intended to show. What she failed to realize was that true power doesn't need a title to demand respect. It doesn't need to raise its voice or seek validation. True power, like the kind demonstrated by the governor, lies in stillness, restraint, and the unshakable foundation of integrity. And when placed side by side with prejudice, it becomes impossible to ignore the contrast. The crowd didn't forget. The moment was recorded, remembered, and retold, not out of malice, but because it marked a turning point. It became a symbol of the age-old warning, don't judge a book by its cover. Because the story inside may carry more weight, more history, and more power than your assumptions ever accounted for. And in a world increasingly divided by symbols and slogans, that lesson couldn't have come at a more critical time. The story didn't just end with silence. It rippled. What began as a single moment of confrontation in a local establishment found its way to digital feeds, news segments, blogs, and opinion columns. Some focused on the error, others focused on the lesson. But almost universally, the narrative circled back to one undeniable truth. Real power doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with presence. Critics dissected the situation from every angle. Commentators debated politics, bias, and social division. But amid the voices, one thing remained consistent. The governor's grace under pressure stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had been thrown his way. He never retaliated. He never argued. He never demanded recognition. His composure was the loudest statement made that day. People praised him, not for his title, but for his conduct. In a world that often confuses power with dominance, authority with aggression, and visibility with virtue, he had modeled something far rarer: restraint. He reminded a society addicted to outrage that true leadership is not reactive, it is measured. That dignity doesn't need to prove itself, it simply is. The governor didn't need to defend the emblem on his hat. He didn't need to respond to the assumptions attached to it. He let others talk. He let others judge. And when it mattered most, he let the facts speak, without embellishment, without anger, without ego. His authority wasn't found in a badge or a title, but in how he carried himself when unfairly confronted. Karen, now exposed to a wider audience than she ever anticipated, became a public example. She had intended to be the enforcer of order, the gatekeeper of what she thought was right. Instead, she became the embodiment of what happens when prejudice and pride replace patience and perception. The consequences weren't legal, they were social, reputational, and internal. She had learned the hardest kind of lesson, the kind where no one needs to punish you, because you did it to yourself. Her actions had been voluntary. Her judgment had been swift, but her understanding arrived far too late. And in the eyes of those who watched it unfold, she hadn't just misjudged a man, she had misjudged what strength looks like in the real world. Because strength isn't always forceful. It isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quietest person in the room, choosing not to escalate, even when fully justified to do so. Sometimes it's choosing to walk away with your head held high instead of winning an argument. Sometimes strength looks like calm, and dignity, as it turns out, can be the most disruptive power of all because it makes the loud, the reactive, and the judgmental look exactly as they are: small. The public didn't rally around Karen. They didn't echo her reasoning. They didn't applaud her courage. They saw through it. They recognized the pattern. Because it wasn't just about a hat or a man or a moment. It was about something more common. It was about every time someone in power chose humility over ego. About every moment someone resisted the urge to put someone in their place and instead chose to rise above. The story became a reminder, a modern-day parable whispered through comment sections, reposted on timelines, quoted in speeches. It wasn't the governor's resume that made the impact. It was his restraint. It wasn't Karen's volume that defined the conflict. It was her assumptions. And in the end, the contrast told the world exactly who each of them were. What emerged wasn't scandal, it was reflection. People began to question their own reactions, how quickly they judge, how easily they assign value to appearances, how fast they decide who deserves respect. And that was the real legacy of the moment, not the viral clips or headlines, but the internal inventory it forced people to take. Because at the heart of the incident was a simple truth: dignity doesn't need applause, and it doesn't chase validation. It exists in the stillness between reaction and revenge. It speaks, even when words aren't used. And when challenged, it never buckles under pressure. It grows stronger. In the days that followed, the governor said very little. He didn't capitalize on the attention. He didn't weaponize the incident. He stayed focused on the work he was elected to do. But his silence spoke louder than anything Karen could have ever said. And that silence was filled with something rare in today's world: moral authority. And Karen? She may have walked out of that building thinking the situation was over. But she carried something far heavier than public shame. She carried a new awareness, one that couldn't be shaken by denial or ego. She had seen what real power looked like, and it didn't match the image she had created in her head. It looked nothing like arrogance or force. It looked like patience. It looked like grace. It looked like the kind of person who never needed to raise his voice to be heard by an entire state. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to expect stories for more powerful tales that reveal the truth behind appearances.